I'd like to welcome you to my Thursday Bread History Seminar Workshop. I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Santa Cruz, California. My name is William Rubel. You can find my book, Bread, A Global History, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online sources, possibly also at your public library. I'm writing a larger bread history, and really this work in the seminar series is feeding into this new work that I'm writing. So thank you very much for watching. You can go to my Facebook group, Bread History in Practice, join the group. That's where you will get notifications of the live seminars, and also you will see what people are posting who have attended the seminar. If you want to make breads that are mentioned, then go to my website, williamrubel.com. I don't have all of the recipes from each of these seminars posted, but increasingly I do. So you should look there first in the category seminar. Now, I always start with the same two slides. And so I'm going to do that now. Bread is an invention like a chair, a car, a shoe, a necklace, an iPhone, the computer that you're watching this on. There is nothing natural about bread, except the ingredients. But there's nothing natural about bread. It simply does not occur in nature. And it represents an extremely complex series of processes that have to come together to create the bread, ideally the bread that we love. And that is very true about the bread that we're going to be discussing today, English French bread. And this bread was many people's favorite for hundreds of years. But when you go out at night and look up in the stars, if you're lucky enough to live in a place where you can see the stars, and you look up there and try to find the pattern that says, here is the recipe for the best bread. Well, you're not going to find English French bread, which we're going to talk about today, in the stars. You're not going to find any recipe for bread in the stars. And that's because the recipe for the bread is in our hearts. What's really interesting about the bread we're going to talk about today is that the dream of this particular bread is very different from the dream of the bread that is most popular with many of us today. It's pretty much about as opposite as you can get from a sourdough crusty loaf. Well, thank you very much. Welcome. Let me say a couple things about what a few of you said. Sybil in San Diego. So I think that communal bread ovens are something to look at for community. I think there is a bread oven in Chicago that is in a park that has a monthly bakes. I could probably find you some emails on that. And then historically, trading sourdough starters have played an important role in truces. So in a place like Sardinia, where they had blood feuds until recently, until the 70s, where, you know, like in Romeo and Juliet, families hated each other. There was an official system that if you ran out of starter, if your starter died, you could go to the neighbor, even if it was an enemy, and they would trade. They would exchange. Janet, you mentioned the dough not rising properly, and it was doughy and cheesy. So my advice to all bakers, the best advice on bread baking, one of the best pieces of advice is in this fabulous French book called La Maison Rustique, The Country House. It was first published in the 1550s. And it was, in some sense, one of the first corporate books, although it shifted publishers. It was revised and stayed in print, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and obviously different authors for about 250 years. And it was translated to English in 1593 or 4, And then there was another English edition in 1614 that was edited by Gervase Markham. And many of you will know Gervase Markham from the English Housewife, the most famous early modern British cookbook. And he edited and expanded the bread section especially. So the 1614 edition, you can get all these online, is a bit more interesting, I think, than the 1593 edition. But what the Maison Rustique says in its extensive bread system is advises the housewife. And, you know, baking bread at home has been up until now the female realm, up until now being the last 20 years. I don't want to get too digressed. So if we have more groups and you come to them, I'll digress on this huge shift to male home bakers. But the author, whose last name is Etienne, said, advised the housewife to always pay attention to the dough. And really, bread can't fail. If there's yeast in it or a sourdough starter, it cannot fail if you give it time. Bread is absolutely a time and temperature project. And again, outside today, there's no reason why robots can't make good bread, and they do make good bread, because bread is time and temperature. You have to, so if your kitchen is too cool, it could take 8 hours for it to rise. And too cools would be sort of below 20, 23 Celsius, you know, the 70s in Fahrenheit. The 23, 24, 25, just when we're the most comfortable. The temperature in San Diego, one of the places that's paradise on earth, that's the best time, you know, temperature for rising bread. So, and this will apply to this bread here today also. If you're not controlling the temperature when the bread is rising, it doesn't matter if the recipe says it'll rise in an hour or 2 hours. It could take longer. So just, you cannot fail if you give the bread time to work.
I could add something from the previous experience of making this bread with a smaller group with William. We started it in the evening, and I think our colleague in Nairobi went pretty well straight ahead to rising, baking, and so on. But I and a friend in Italy, we both left the dough overnight and baked it the next day. She baked it in the morning, but it was cool here, and I didn't bake it until sort of midday or just after lunch the following day, because it actually had a chance to warm up and start getting active by then. Yeah, so I learned that lesson about time being the important thing, and not the time the recipe suggests, but the time the dough tells you.
The real time. Commercial recipes, and there's a couple of commercial bakers here. Commercial recipes specify the times for everything and the temperatures, including the temperature of the dough. So this recipe is called French bread. It was published in 1708, and it's a fabulous one. And for you, I think it's Chris with your bakery in London. This would be a great bread because it's absolutely tied to British baking history, and it's fabulous, accessible, very easy to make. It does not use sourdough, and I will talk about that in a minute. But let me read it to you. Take 1 quart of flour, that's 4 liters, 1 quart of flour, 3 eggs, a little barm, and a little butter. Mix them with the flour very light, with a little new milk warmed. Then lay it by the fire to rise. Then make it into little loaves. Flour it very well and bake it in a quick oven. How many of you don't know what barm is? Do all of you know what barm is? Speak up if you don't, because I'm going to move on.
I don't know what barm is.
Okay. So barm is yeast that rose to the surface of ale when ale was being fermented. So technically, in early modern English, ale is top fermenting. beer was bottom fermenting. And beer did bottom fermenting brews. And of course, we use beer also to mean generically beer and ale now. But bottom fermenting brews, beer, require refrigeration, and they didn't really come into fore, as I understand it. And there could be a beer specialist here who knows more than I do, until the 19th century, till really industrialization. The British used ale yeast, and it floats to the top. So there'd be this scum that would rise, and you would just ladle that off, or you can wait until you've drained the vat and you take the sediment. And that is barm or yeast. And the words are interchangeable in early modern cookbooks. Early modern is up to 1800, and then from 1800 is the modern period. We, of course, are in the postmodern period or floating in space. We're not sure which. Barm became a problematic ingredient towards the end of the 1700s and was a very big problem in the 1800s because, especially in the UK, people were getting their yeast from the brewer, and the brewers were increasingly adding more and more hops. They were increasing the hop content. So in the 1400s, ale was not hopped. Remember, hops is a bittering agent that was not native to British beer making. It became bitter and bitterer, and you start to find in recipes that people will say, you need to be careful of the ale, of the yeast, it may be bitter, you need to wash it. You can rinse, but you actually cannot separate out the bitter flavor from the hops from the yeast because there gets to be an actual electrical bond. So in this period, though, it's fairly mild. And in my experiments, the taste of the beer made with a low hop barm and commercial yeast, it's not worth the effort. But that's what this means.
William, there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
About the quantity of yeast suggested for the amount of flour, and also a question about the measures, whether British quarts and
okay. So well, let's start with the measures first. For those Americans in the group who are interpreting early modern bread recipes, we're in luck because the American measuring system, the common American measuring system, is the system that was in effect in 1708. So this is just, this quart is the American quart. The British figures didn't change till 1826 when Britain, for I'm sure commercial reasons, decided to go to imperial. So it doesn't count. So this is just a quart's a quart. Okay. And a quart is a liter and a quart are so close to each other that you can just use a liter. Okay, was there another question?
Are you finished?
Okay. Let me come here and
I have a question, which was about the yeast, the amount of the instant yeast or the dry yeast to the fairly small amount of flour.
Okay, so these recipes were intended to be risen quickly. So it calls for this. So I'm giving between, I think I put in 1.5% yeast. I usually make my breads with 1%, but a lot of modern bread recipes use 1.5.
Please don't do that now.
And it is true. It's true that the yeast that the so-called instant yeast that gets folded into the flour is more potent than the yeast that you're supposed to rehydrate first. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. Both of those yeasts are the product of American wars. The first yeast that you dissolve in water is from World War II, and the yeast that you can fold into the flour is Vietnam War. And the difference is how they are milled. The Vietnam War era yeast is milled finer. There's more surface area, and it is faster to rehydrate, but there's become a blurring of the edges. So you can mix both of the yeasts into the dough. It doesn't really matter.
Thank you.
Okay. French bread. The French have been recognized as the world's greatest bakers for hundreds and hundreds of years. I have no idea when that started. No idea. In the great book, The French Gardener by Nicolas de Bonifant, there is a big section on bread. Pardon me, it's called Délices de la Campagne by Nicolas de Bonifant. He also wrote The French Gardener. And he opens his bread section by saying that the French are known throughout the world for having the best bread. And that was 1650. And of course, you know, they still have this association, you know, no matter how great the bread is in Germany or in Scandinavia, those of you who travel to those countries in Europe, you know, it's still, French is up here. Even though, you know, in their Coupe du Monde, the big French baking contest, they no longer consistently win. In fact, they rarely win. They still are thought of as having the best bread in the world. And there is an aspect to this that is completely true, is that they are the only people that we can see, the only cuisine, where the taste of the bread is absolutely paramount and where the bakers are clearly thinking about the taste when they're making it. As an example, in the bread recipes in Délices de la Campagne, Bonifant actually says, break off a walnut-sized piece and bake it, taste it, and then adjust your recipe.
Wow.
There is no way any Anglo-American baker is ever going to say, hey, bake a little bit, see what you think, and then, you know, make some adjustments. In English cuisine, there's a big divide between those who said, well, we can divide it now politically, to the Brexit people versus the EU people. So there were those who said, we're British, we eat British food, the French are effete, and they are concerned with frivolous things, and that is morally bad. Morally bad. You find this especially in Pride and Prejudice, for example, with Jane Austen. Jane Austen herself says she prefers a plain dish to a ragout, and in Northanger Abbey, there's a character, the mother of a character named Catherine, and she challenges, the mother challenges her daughter for having praised the luxuries on General Tilney's table. And what she says is, I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much about the French bread at Northanger. I'm sure I do not care about the bread. It's all the same to me what I eat. So this is a bread where it matters what you eat. And in the cookbooks in the Britain in the 18th century that have French bread and French recipes like ragout, these are Francophilic, they're pro-EU, we can say. And the others are like the Americans that just say, look, I'm American, I eat meat and potatoes, and it was good enough for my grandparent, it's good enough for me. So this is a bread of somebody who is saying, I'm of the world. The high status European bread for centuries had been a very, 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 very dense bread, a bread made with 50% water by weight of flour or even less. An American bagel is 50% water by weight of flour. Sandwich bread is 60%. French bread starts at 75%. ciabatta starts at 80% and goes all the way to 100% water to flour. In other words, a batter like a lot of our starters. So this bread was replacing the manchet on the British table. And so the rich person, the affluent person, and the person who's interested in high status tastes, like today it's sourdough is the high status tastes, is going to have wanted this bread. What's very unusual about this recipe and why I like it is it takes a quart of flour, whereas there's no other recipe from this period that I'm aware of, and maybe those of you who redacted from that period have seen one I haven't, that uses less than a peck, which is a gallon of flour or 16 liters, or a bushel, which is 8 gallons or 32 liters of flour. So this is really a strange recipe because they still did not have iron stoves. This was baked in a wood-fired oven, presumably in a pastry oven, a small one that people baked for their pastries and pies. But it's only for £1. And it is broken up into small loaves. So this is actually for rolls. Now, there's one aspect here, one important detail that is not in the recipe, It says to bake in a quick oven. Now, how many of you have heard of the humoral system of medicine? The humors.
Lots, yeah.
Yes, no, everybody a little bit, you know, and you know, when somebody says they are, bad spleen. What were you going to say, Richard?
Phlegmatic.
Yeah, phlegmatic. All of those relate to the humors. So, you know, salad dressing, oil and vinegar. In this system, oil was considered cold and vinegar is considered, the salad is considered cold. The vinegar is considered hot. And so the salad dressing lets you mediate to add the hot to the cold in order to make the salad more neutral. So it was important that what you ate matched your own personality, whether you were hot or cold and had various other issues on the humoral scale. And one big problem for those bread lovers in the early modern period and before is that people like us, rich people, you see my hands, I don't have any calluses, you see no on the hands. So we can say I don't work for a living. And people like us, we believed we had different constitutions from the workers, from the people with calloused hands. It was a different kind of racism. It wasn't necessarily, was not explicitly associated with skin color, but it was felt that people who worked had different stomachs. And famously in this fabulous 1550s medical manual called The Haven for Health by Cogan Thomas, he said, you know, that they can eat, for example, a flatbread made with pea flour because they have stomachs like monkeys. They can even digest iron. So it was thought that the crust of bread was indigestible to people like us. It hurt our stomachs. We would just be in a bad way. And this also went, by the way, to our race horses. So our fancy horses also were fed bread, but the crust was chipped off. The most recent example of chipping is the 1924 edition of the American Settlement House Cookbook. My mother used it, I use it. And it's the last example I've read in an English language cookbook where you baked a French roll and you chipped off the crust. So Robert May in The Accomplished Cook, he specifies chipping the crust. Hannah Glass in Cooking Plain and Easy, 1748 popular book, chipping the crust. So this doesn't say to chip the crust, but what you're really supposed to do is bake this rolls in a very hot oven. And when it's very hot, you take a knife and you chip it off. You can also use a rasp, which is not a file, but a rasp. the Settlement House cookbook is very good with an instruction that I haven't read elsewhere. She says, after you've chipped it, put it back in the oven to crisp it up for a couple minutes. And that certainly covers for bad technique, which by 1924, a few people would be experienced doing this. I guess the last on the chipping, in Our Mutual Friend, one of the great novels by Dickens, there is this just horrible, horrible figure, a sycophant, Ms. Talks. And as Dombey's empire is collapsing, and he's in this mansion and his world is falling apart and he's going bankrupt and becoming a pauper, Ms. Talks, who is the kind of person that works for Donald Trump, yes, 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 and apes the upper class habits. So she is in her one-room bedsit, and she has a French bread rasped, and she has a new laid egg, or warranted to be, and then she also has tea, 1 teaspoon per cup and 1 for the pot. So Dickens really saw this as an upper class affectation by the 19th century. Okay, on to the recipe. 1 quart of flour, so that works out when you measure it to the 500 grams that I recommended. 3 eggs. I have home chickens. I have weighed all the different sized eggs, and the standard egg, which weighs about 60 grams with the shell, is about right. So those are the only things in this recipe that are specific. And I know a lot of people redacting recipes are put off by the fact they can't figure out, there's no quantities. Usually the author will tell you something that helps you deduce the quantities. And in this case, we're mixing the little butter, the little barm, the little flour, and the little milk. We're mixing it all very light, very light. So it's a soft dough. And I actually tested it yesterday when I made that mistake by changing the flour quantity, but not the other. What did I just do with my knife? 1 second. My knife was right here. So this is a loaf I made. I always make it in loaf form. And I think you've seen on my website, and here's the crumb. And this is from a 60%, which is what a modern sandwich bread is. Today we're making it at about 70%, which is how I normally do it. It'll be a little bit softer. You'll get slightly larger air holes. But what you're always going for here is, even eyes. The baker's, what's the professional name, Chris? Areoles or something? Avioles? Anyone want to speak up with the baker language? Well, the early modern language is eyes. Somebody speaking?
I had a question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, when I see the shape of that loaf, I wonder if this was the origin of the shape of the current, what we know of as an English style loaf, with that puffy top and the straight sides.
So there were not very many. Thank you for the question, and I'll answer it in my usual regressive way.
Good.
So I'm going to answer it slightly larger. In this period, this loaf would not ever have been made in a tin in its own period. When they were made in the tin, they were called bricks.
Okay.
And how many of you know how to use Google Books, search on Google Books? Mm-hmm. Who doesn't? Who has never searched on Google Books? I can't see everybody, so raise your hand. Speak up if you've never. Has anyone here not searched on Google Books?
I don't think I have.
Okay, so Google Books is, one of the most amazing accomplishments of the 21st century. And you find it at books.google.com. And you know, one of the astonishing things about Google is that they have just undertaken projects that are clearly impossible and then accomplished them in very short periods of time. And one idea they had that is clearly impossible is to scan every book in every library in the world. However, that's what they have done. So increasingly, there is no reason ever to use a specialized database to get back, like to La Maison Rustique from a 1616 edition. You're going to find it there. So you can word search essentially every word of every book ever written in English or French or German or Portuguese, or whatever languages that you know for the most part. But it's very strong in English. So if you, what was your question, Judy? Quick.
It was, I don't think I've forgotten. Was it about the shape?
That's right. So if you type in penny brick,
penny
brick, and you can limit it to the time. So give it the date range 1700 to 1800. You'll get lots and lots of references to the penny brick. And it's one of my great frustrations because how much did the penny brick weigh? We don't know. So this was made as rolls, and I'm sure they were round. When you get served a basket of rolls in the restaurant, in the white tablecloth restaurant, you're being served a high status bread from the past. As always, we rich people demand extra care. We want people to fuss over us. The 1 pound loaf that we all know is actually the loaf for the rich people. We had 1 pound loaves, even in 1600, even in 1550. But as you went down the social class, the loaves got bigger and bigger and bigger. Most of you have been to the Louvre, I'm sure. Those of you who haven't, the next time you can go to the Louvre, you go look at the Chardin paintings, and there's this great painting of the servant girl, and she's standing with this huge loaf on her hip, on her hip. She's very shapely. It fits there, and she looks, of course, complicated painting. But the breads were really, 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 really big. So this one for rolls means it's high status, more handwork. Okay? Any questions before we mix and then have a general discussion?
I do have one which I had posted in the chat, which is just for those of us without backyard chickens, do we look for medium, large, or extra large eggs?
Well, just a regular egg, just your standard egg, double A. Your egg's going to weigh 60. You know, it doesn't make that much difference. You know, this is a recipe written, a little of this, a little of this, a little of this, make the dough like that. So, you know, we have gotten trained that there is one way to do it. And there isn't one way to do it. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, we get lost, you know, with this. And I think when I publish this recipe, I'm going to publish it with the range from about 60% hydration to about the 70% that we're using today.
I happen to have duck eggs, so I'm using duck eggs today.
Yes.
See how that is.
So peasant country people would have substituted. And I don't know, any of you who've done ethnographic research, you find that the ingredients that go into the blini in the Lithuanian countryside are not necessarily the ingredients that go in the blini in the cookbook, because they could be doing, like using buttermilk that Bonnie mentioned, for example. Okay, shall we mix? Now, one thing I've been doing, so this calls for warming the liquid ingredients. So I would do that first. So I would pour them together, and I have started using my microwave for this kind of thing. So I would warm the milk and put it in the microwave. Just, you know, don't scald it, but bring it up to temperature. And of course the microwave makes the cleaning easier. So I'm pouring my milk together, and I'm gonna go over and give this a few seconds in the microwave. So let's do that first. And then go ahead, just keep going. So if you haven't mixed the eggs, then mix the eggs. Now, I'm sure you can all hear me, even if some of you are off warming. The one part of this recipe where I probably am not using authentic technique, I'm not certain, and those of you who worked at Plymouth or Richard, other places, I'm adding the butter. So I've got the warm milk, I'm putting it in a bowl, and I'm taking my butter, and I'm breaking it up into little pieces and putting it in the warm milk. And I don't know. I don't know if that's how they would have done it. They could also have just taken the butter and put it into the dough. I like doing it this way. I think a lot of us keep the butter in the refrigerator. Depending on where you live, have it in the refrigerator. This just ensures that we are not going to mix the dough. And this is a dough, remember, that's not kneaded. When we get to this, I mean, don't mix the flour yet. This is a dough that is not kneaded. So I use a whisk and just break it up, and they sort of melt a bit. It doesn't have to be completely melted, but and sitting there in that warm milk, it lets us knead the bread less. So everyone here is familiar with brioche, and everyone here is familiar with Marie Antoinette allegedly saying, "Let the starving, angry, revolutionary people eat cake." In French, brioche is called gâteau de brioche. It is, given the moniker of cake. And like brioche, this is cake-like. And as you know, so cakes are not kneaded. We knead bread. So we're just going to mix this the least bit possible. And it gives you a very nice texture, and it makes it very crumbly. It's going to give you a crumbly bread when you bake it out. So that's another reason why I like to melt the butter a bit in the milk, and that reduces the need to overwork the dough. So now, if you all are ready, then I would mix the milk and the eggs together. And then, very important not to be neglectful, as I am occasionally. So you can pour your yeast into the flour. And again, whether it's instant yeast or whether it is the other kind of granulated yeast, and just mix it around. Now, this recipe does not have salt. Yeah. So I think discussing salt will be a good thing to do as we are making it or talking later. Salt is an optional ingredient in bread. Historically, bread recipes either had no salt or what we would consider a de minimis quantity of salt. In this case, there is no salt. And I actually ate this bread. I purchased a roll from a street vendor in Guanajuato, Mexico, about 13, 14 years ago. and I bit into this bread, and it was this bread. I was making this bread at that time. And that's how slow I've been writing this book, okay? And I asked him the recipe, and it was this list of ingredients. And then he said, no sal, no sal. Bread without salt is wonderful. It will taste flat at first, but then you will start to taste the more subtle flavors of the bread. And it may take you a few loaves to get there. Of course, if you're putting butter and jam on this, if you're putting a little slice of prosciutto on it, if you're making sippets out of it, if you're like frying it in butter, sprinkle it with some salt, and pouring soup over it, then you know, you're adding the salt some other place. So how are you guys for where is everyone in the recipe? Are you ready to add it to the flour?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then we should just add it to the flour, and so they would have done this by hand, for sure. And until recently, in Kenya, I have seen in Kenya, in bakeries that are still mixing these massive amounts of dough by hand. If you want to keep your hands dry, you can use a little spatula for the first bit. So you're going to mix this roughly. So just like you do pie crust, where you're, you know, being careful not to overmix. I think everybody here is experienced baker except maybe Bonnie. So just, it's going to be a little bit of a mess. Now, there's always questions what to do with your hands. Once you've done this, and we're going to knead it, we're going to pour it out on a counter. You might want to wash your hands. And there's two ways to deal with hands and dough and stickiness. One of them is to keep your hands wet. I actually learned this in Lithuania from a peasant in around 1988 or 89. And you can dip them in water, and I do that often. And the other way is to put oil on your hands, like just to spread it with olive oil. And you'll see from YouTube, you know, different, you know, some of the great bakers, you know, Cyril Hitz does it one way. Peter Reinhardt might do it another way. You know, it doesn't really matter, but it also can be helpful. I'm using this marble here, and I am going to just drop a little olive oil on it. Those of you who look at YouTube.
William?
Yes?
William, you focus the camera so we can see what we're doing. All we can see is your shoulders. I would love to see the dough.
Sorry,
what
okay.
You're doing.
So right now, my dough is a mess, okay?
Yeah, good.
And so it's clearly not,
Yeah.
okay. So that's at the point that I do that last step. Is it called la frissage when you're making pie crust? What's the French term? Somebody help me. Okay. Anyway, I'm also put a drop of
it's frissage.
Frissage. Okay. So I'm putting a drop of olive oil on my marble. Peter Reinhardt, whose bread books, American author for those of you in Britain and Ireland, is a very good American bread book author. And you'll see with his YouTube videos, he always has a little spray can of shortening. So I'm going to dump this out on my tray here. And
so you're actually going to knead it?
I'm going to do the frissage, which is it's a.
So you just kind of put your hands and you squeeze it together kind of a little bit.
Well, no, you're going to do this. Let's see how to do this. let's
So
see.
we actually want to develop the gluten?
No, we don't. So, okay, here's the dough.
Good.
So I'm going to just, first I'm doing this forward motion, and it's going to be a little bit of kneading. Once,
yeah,
twice, 3 times.
William, this is
I'm
David.
pretty much there.
It's
David, what are you saying?
It's kind of a smear and fold.
Smear and fold. Now that's really good. Yes, smear and fold. So, you know, I'm doing it 4 or 5 times. And it's coming together now as a ball. I would probably now, and it's at this point, to completely finish it, I will clean my hands. I didn't put oil. I forgot to put oil in my hands. So I'm going to go wash my hands because I want the last bit. I want my hands clean. Okay, so my hands are clean and I put a little oil on them and I'm just going to 1, 2, what am I doing? 3, and I'm doing 4 and I'm done. So I would say that is.
So do we want a baby bum dough or do we want it a little bit rough?
Excuse me?
Should it feel like a baby's bum or should it be a bit rough? I'm thinking of smooth, not so much poking.
Yeah, well, more like the baby's bum, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it should be fully incorporated.
Okay.
That looks beautiful. Yeah, yeah, that looks great. That looks great. Okay, so then you want to put it in the original recipe, he says, milk warmed, then lay it by the fire. So, you know, they had the fireplace going all the time. And, you know, they would have chosen a distance. But I have a little electric oven, actually. I only have a toaster oven and a bread oven outdoors. But in my house, I just have a nice, well, I love it. It's my religion. I have a Breville. I'll say the brand name. I have a Breville toaster oven, and it's a dream. It has a proofing function. So I will be putting this at 38 degrees Celsius. Okay. So that's 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'll be putting in the proofing oven at 38. And it's really annoying to have sticky bowls. So I would put some butter or olive oil or something, you know, just coat your bowl a little bit, or plastic tub. I'm moving away from plastic in my life as much as possible. I think it seems advisable for all of us to do so.
Another
but
trick.
whatever.
Sorry.
Excuse me,
Another
Judy?
trick I've done is to turn the dryer on for 10 minutes and then turn it off and then just set the bowl in the dryer. There's residual warmth.
One of the things I've done is take a ceramic bowl and a plate to cover it, fill the bowl about halfway with water, put it in the microwave for a couple of minutes, and then pour out the water. So you have the warm ceramic bowl retaining heat.
Right. Similar idea.
These are all very, very, very good ideas. And you know, they would have, you know, it's very, very possible. This is a British.
Right.
This is, you know, they're very, very heavy. This is for rising the bread. Although this is such a de minimis quantity. But Richard is quite right. They would have definitely been using ceramic that would have held in the heat. So with that inspiration, I'm going to get a little ceramic bowl and put it in my proofing oven.
William, someone wanted to talk about water content if using sourdough.
Hold on.
So perhaps you can say something about, you know, just working out that liquid quantity when you use
I'll
sourdough.
do that. I'm going to get this in the oven and then I will do that.
I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
I didn't see it. So I'm using this bowl. And I do think, you know, when you're cooking, I think you can see, I'm in my kitchen. What you see behind me is some of the culinary things I've collected. I do like to use beautiful things. This marble is for making chapatis and has this beautiful pattern underneath.
Beautiful.
And I think it just makes baking, makes everything more, what's more fun,
Yeah.
more lovely. Do cover your dough. You don't want to get a crust. I'm sure you all do that anyway, but don't forget.
William, may I ask a question?
Yes, Richard.
I have a dough here. I wanted to ask your assessment of it. I think I had at first not added enough flour somehow, must have mismeasured. So I added a little more by eyeball to try to get it to look about like yours. Is that about right?
I think it's about right, yes. And remember, you know, it's this is not pastry making. So, and what I mean by that is I guess pastry making can be like the rocket science of, of the baking business, where you have to actually be precise. Okay. Sourdough. Okay, who is it who has a starter? We'll talk about sourdough, but who has the starter in the group? Is somebody here with a starter needing?
Well, I'd be interested in knowing if you did.
I'll ask the question in the chat.
Okay, because there's somebody who had emailed.
And Mahala as well asked about it.
Okay, do you leave out the water? Who is that talking?
Hi.
Hi, okay. Hi. How much starter do you have?
I just added it and adjusted slightly,
Right.
hoping for the best. I added a little bit extra water because it's 60% hydration.
Oh, you got 60%. That's nice. Yeah. Okay, great, perfect. So you did.
I think it should be fine, hopefully. But but if you have like a specific kind of calculation, that would be interesting.
No, I mean, I think you just did.
But yeah.
Okay. Everyone understand what she said?
Yeah.
She had a 60% hydration starter, so she just used that basically as the water for the recipe. And made a small adjustment. So let's talk about sourdough and bread history for a minute. So sourdough, okay, who wants to tell me what sourdough is?
Sourdough is a water and flour mix that gradually over the course of about 2 weeks, the various bacteria give way to each other as it acidifies, and then the wild yeast, which is in the grain mostly, some people think it's in the air, but I think it's quite well understood to see that it's in the flour. It gradually takes over because it likes that acid environment, and then once that happens, you've got a mature starter and you can start baking bread. Okay,
somebody else would like to explain it also?
I see sourdough as basically having a pet. You have a living organism, which is a yeast that is around us in the air, but is also falls into the starter to chow down on the whatever carbohydrate we have, the flour, maybe some sugar or no. And you have to pay attention to it like you do a pet. You have to make sure that it has enough nutrition, that its environment is good, and that you use it.
I simply understand it to just be fermented dough.
That's fun.
What does that mean? Farrell. You can't just use, what do you mean by fermented, since you're saying just a fermented dough?
Just that it has been left to, similar to what Judy had said, it has been left to ferment, to consume itself to produce air inside of it over a period of time. I have learned through years of being very sort of precious and delicate about it that it's much more resilient than I originally thought it was. Yeah, fermentation. That's what
fermentation. Okay, well, what produces the air? So first of all,
there's several different, there's yeast strains or lactobacillus that consumes the flour and creates the air, similar to a human being consuming food. That's my understanding.
The bacteria consume the starch. They change it to the sugar, which is what the yeast lives on. The yeast lives on sugar.
Okay.
And then it produces the same as with wine, CO2 and alcohol.
Beautiful. Judy. David, were you going to say something?
Oh, same with what Judy just said.
That's right. Okay. Thank you, Judy. So a sourdough starter. So let's not talk about how it gets in there. What you have is a symbiotic soup of approximately 100 bacteria, mostly in the lactobacillus group, to one yeast. But 100%, and it's a symbiotic relationship. So as David and Judy are saying, the bacteria are acidifying the dough, but also they're triggering reactions that release some foods, some sugars to the yeasts. Who knows the botanical name for standard bread yeast? Call it out.
Starts with a C. I don't know. Can't remember.
Nobody?
Is it Saccharomyces cerevisiae?
Beautiful. And what yeast is the standard yeast for making beer? Who just spoke?
Chris.
Yeah, okay, Chris.
What do you use? No idea. Is it the same? It's not the same.
Be confident. Be confident. Okay. It's the same. And what about for wine? And what about for wine? What's the yeast for wine? Anyone?
Same.
Same. Okay, Chris. Yeah, have some confidence. How about for palm wine? How about for palm wine in West Africa?
Can we guess that?
Say same. Trick question. I'm going to say
it's
same
again.
question.
And what about sake? What about sake in Japan?
I think there might be the same again, by any chance.
That's right. And now, when you've seen like a Burden of Dreams, that amazing Fitzcarraldo movie where they break up a boat and move it across the jungle to change river systems in Brazil, and there's this documentary by Les Blank of the making of Fitzcarraldo. How many of you have seen that Les Blank documentary? Anyone? Jane? Okay, it's fantastic. So there's one bit, Les Blank does not like being in the jungle. He ends up just hating it. And at some point he's in a village and they're making their alcohol, which they make by people chewing the raw ingredients and then spitting them into the big tub. So they initiate the process of fermentation by chewing, getting enzymes going in the saliva. What's the yeast for that one? Come on, speak up.
Same.
Exactly. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a semi-domesticated organism, exactly the same in genetic terms as a cat is a semi-domesticated organism versus a dog that is fully domesticated. Now, this is a test, but you guys know the answer to it. You know the answer. What is one of the biggest differences between a wolf and a dog, or I should say a dog and a wolf? What can a dog do that a wolf cannot do?
A dog can tell what its master wants by responding to gestures, eyes, and a wolf would ignore that.
That's very good, Judy, but the wrong answer.
Oh, sounded good.
What?
Dogs also breed, any female dog can breed, whereas in a wolf pack, only the alpha lady can breed.
Very good, but not the right answer. Dogs can eat
anything.
They can eat bread. No, specifically, they can digest starches. So the bread culture dogs eat bread. The rice culture dogs are eating rice. The cassava culture dogs are eating cassava.
Interesting.
And it's a big difference is that they can metabolize bread. So everywhere there are humans, there's dogs. And everywhere there's humans, there is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's the yeast in the package. Now there's different strains. There are different strains. Now the bread strains now, and in the 19th century, in this period, there were no bread yeasts. You could only get yeast from the brewer. And it's generally in the brewing places where bread was risen with yeast because there were, more brewers than, vintners lying, you make wine on this annual basis, but you're always brewing beer. So the sourdough starter really is yeast leavened, and most of the times you sequence those starters, it is the yeast from the package. And how it gets there is still contested, but it is in the air, it's on our hands, it's in our spit, it's on our surfaces, it's everywhere we are. Any other questions? Anything else?
I have a quick question for you, William.
Sure.
Just because you're speaking about how yeast is in the atmosphere and all around us. In your opinion, given some of the recent studies that have been done around trying to revive ancient yeast, for example, do you think that it is possible to actually isolate ancient yeast when they're completely surrounded by modern yeast strains that are on absolutely everything? Or do you think that it's going to be contaminated?
Okay, I'm going to turn off my oven. I'm going to turn off my oven so I don't have the proofing fan going.
Okay. I figured you would know the answer to this.
Okay, yeah. Well, no, I do know the answer, and I also know what you're referring to.
Yeah.
So amazing, the man who invented the Xbox and has become obviously a billionaire. He's gotten very interested in making bread and interested in yeast, and has gotten some samples from the inside of pottery, of ancient Egyptian pottery from museums, and has made some bread from some starters that have been started from these scrapings. So this field where you do things with scrapings is called archaeobotany. And it's a very exciting field, and that's, I could talk literally for hours about archaeobotany and bread. It is just exploding the last few years because all of these increase in computer power means that the analysis of ancient botanical residues are becoming more and more sophisticated. So in theory, yes, you can get a scraping from a pot in the past, and you can work out pretty much what was in that pot. For different enzymes, amino acids, you can figure out whether it was meat, whether it was this or that, and stuff. So whether you can revive an ancient yeast and whether you can do that without contamination, well, that's up to the experimenting, the experimental, the quality of the work. I think we have to assume this man is wealthy enough and he's hired really top people to work for him, or they're volunteering, that it is going to be done, it is being done professionally. What's unprofessional is that he keeps publishing on his Twitter feed and flooding all the bread groups with the reports of his making this bread. So the state is that this yeast has been, the man's making bread with a starter, but it has not yet been sequenced. So when you sequence it, then you can compare the yeast in this starter with the modern yeast. And then you can see, and compare is that there, if you look at papers, what you get with DNA studies is all these stripes, like barcodes. Mm-hmm. It comes out looking like a barcode. It's such endless barcodes. And they match up these barcodes. And where they're the same, then it's the same. Where it's a bit different, then these people, the scientists, can tell you whether it's genetic shift or not. So what you would expect to find is that you can identify it as the species Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but there's things about it that are not the same as the modern strand. So the answer is yes, you can do that. It has not been done.
But the loaf itself will be contaminated potentially with modern yeast, simply because it is out in the open air.
The answer to that is yes, but no. So the reason that your sourdough starters are able to remain stable from mix to mix, or your yogurt, I know Harold McGee, who writes these books on food chemistry. He makes yogurt every day from a yogurt that he got, I can't remember, 30, 35 years ago. So the starters are stable because when you introduce your starter to the new batch of dough, to the new foodstuffs, the new substrate, you overwhelm the stray native bacteria and yeasts. They get out-competed because the starter gives a head start to the ones you've got. So the answer, so yes, Farrell, there will be the modern yeasts, but they will lose the war. They will be annihilated.
Okay.
And so that's why the starters are reasonably stable.
Thank you.
William, I have a question about that experiment that's ongoing with the Xbox man. I know he's attempted to bake a loaf in a cone shape in a backyard sort of looks like a campfire. The cone shape in Egyptian bread, would it have had a top on it, or would it have been just inserted into the embers? Because in his case, he put a top on it, and then he heaped the embers on top, I guess like a Dutch oven, a ceramic Dutch oven.
Okay, I do not want to comment on exactly what methodology.
No, I don't.
I'm going to answer your question, Judy, but I want to make clear is that I am sure that whatever he is doing, he has an archaeological basis for it because of who he is.
Sure,
okay?
I get that.
Okay,
but I know you also are an expert in Egypt bread.
No, I know something that's right. So I'm going to tell you what. But I wanted just to preface is I think we need to give him the credit of doubt and assume that what he's doing, because that is a part of his report that I don't understand. Like, I don't understand why he's making the cone shape.
Mm-hmm.
It's one shape,
mm-hmm.
but I can show you this bread here. Jane and I were in Egypt at Christmas time, and in a lot of the tombs, tomb paintings, you see loaves. I wasn't being careful here. They would be exactly round and would have been peasant, they would have been perfect. I was just testing something. But one thing that's interesting, and also they have dots in them. They have holes.
Uh-huh.
And there are extant breads, and you can see in them, if you go online and type in Egyptian bread images and enlarge them, you're going to see the depressions. Okay. But what you'll also notice is that a lot of the breads are white in the paintings in the tombs. And they're white like the geese are white. The women's faces are white. Their onions are white. It's clear looking at the pictures that they're white. So I think, and also you can see from samples of actual breads that some of them are white. So actually, I think they were painted with whitewash. So that's what this is a sample of. But this is a far more common shape than that oval shape.
It would be, because there's less labor involved.
Right. Also, right, and they're making them in vast quantities, like for a ceremony okay. Anyway, like in ceremonies, they would make 100,000 loaves for a big ceremony. Okay, back to the subject. Question about this bread, early modern bread. Any questions? Okay, so sourdough. Sourdough is a common way that bread is made in the world. Mm-hmm. But this yeast, we can tell from its genome that this yeast is a semi-domesticated organism. And so it has less genetic diversity than this yeast that you find in nature. It is a yeast that is almost non-existent in nature. It's very hard to find it. I mean, like, it's amazingly hard to find it in nature. But when you do, there's more variation. In countries like the UK, like Great Britain, like the Netherlands, that were beer countries, the people made bread from that beer yeast. And that is also the case in Egypt. Now, Delwyn Samuel, who's a member of the bread group, and she has a very good website called ancientgrains.org. All of her papers are published there. And she's the one who innovated the scraping the sides of Egyptian containers and looking at them under scanning electron microscopes. So she says, this beer was probably more like a sourdough starter. It's got lactic acids in it. Mm-hmm. The British breads were not made with sourdough. And I think, Chris, this is really important because you see all these artisan bakers in London with websites saying that you're making a bread from the sourdough bread from British tradition. But it isn't a recent tradition.
Would you say that historically that making bread with beer in the UK goes way back? So they have been making beer for hundreds, thousands of years, right? So would you say that type of bread had always been made with a beer yeast, or so there's no tradition whatsoever of what we think of as sourdough today?
So the answer is yes. I do think where there's beer, that's the yeast that the bakers make.
That's very makes a lot of sense.
But some provisos. One is, if you weren't making, a poor person couldn't afford to make beer. We're poor. If you're a landless peasant, you weren't making your own beer. So then you would have to buy the yeast. The yeast is a profit center in the breweries. There's a wonderful letter from the 1770s of two women walking, I think it was it was in New York, outskirts of New York, and there were all these big mansions, and one woman says in this, anyway, there's a woman writing to somebody else, it's from a letter. Anyway, and she says is that all these mansions is yeast money. So breweries would sometimes produce to make the bread yeast, and depending on the weather and situation, they could be able to charge a surcharge. So fortunes were made on it. It was a waste product.
Interesting.
Okay, that said, it was expensive because bakers needed it and rich people did. So but by the time you're a poor person, before refrigeration, going there to get the dregs of the yeast that is going to be deteriorating very quickly in the heat, it wasn't practical. Mm-hmm. So poor people did make sourdough breads, but they didn't, but in the British literature, it's clear they didn't really know how. And they also had associated, up until the germ theory of disease in the late 19th century, people felt associated the sour stomach and gastroenteritis as being caused by sour things you ate, including sour bread. So sour bread was considered unhealthy. and sourdough was thus unhealthy. So I won't say that it doesn't exist, but it's very clear from the cookbooks that it was an exotic, because the cookbooks, the British ones.
These things are somewhat intertwined, because if they were looked down on as being unhealthy, part of that was because the lower classes were consuming it. There had to be a social thing as well as a supposed health thing.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely, absolutely, and also, yeasted breads rise a little bit better, a little bit more. This expression "light," when he says to make it up light.
Right.
So in the health manuals, a light bread is better for you than a super dense bread.
Right. Again, you're talking about the medical, the peasants eat what's grown in the ground and the nobles eat what flies in the air.
That's right. That's right. And Judy's referring to sort of a bigger idea of the great chain of being. Where what's higher, closer to God and taller is more blessed, is more good than things closer to the ground.
There's also references by Markham and I think Hugh Platt about sourdough. I mean, basically, if your bread had soured, it had gone bad.
Yes.
And it's mainly in the more whole grain breads, in the horse breads, that you see some elements of the sourdough being more dominant, or it being allowed to sit there and rest for a series of days versus trying to grab a barm and use the whitest or the fine flour.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And David referred to Markham. In the English Housewife, there are 3 bread recipes, starting with manchet for the master, a household loaf for the servants, and then a brown bread, he calls it, for the hind servants. Hind servants were the field workers. And his first instruction is just mix this bread, which was pea flour adulterating a coarse flour. Just let it sit and sour in the trough, which would really be disgusting. And if it really doesn't work, he said, add some yeast. So that's right. There's definitely, down market is the sour.
It's real tangy.
It's tangy, yeah.
Yeah.
I noticed in a really old Canadian cookbook, which is 1831, I think the earliest one for Canada, which is not an old country, there would say, take a pint of good yeast. So I'm guessing it would be the beer yeast, or maybe a big dollop of sourdough. And then they add pearl ash. And I guess that would be trying to reduce the acidity to some degree.
Yes.
In the taste, in the flavor. I mean,
okay, I'm getting some messages in Judy. That might actually be best for a whole separate
okay.
workshop.
Okay,
it's a big subject. So we've been going for an hour and a half, which was the official schedule, and some people in the UK are needing to go. Jane is suggesting that you send photos of your bread when it finishes baking.
Okay.
You could also, those of you who are not members of my Bread History and Practice group, if you go to Facebook, and I know some people have dropped Facebook, but it's good for this kind of thing. So you can go to my group, ask to join if you're not a member, and you could post there. Because what thing has been missing from the Bread History and Practice group has been the practice part. So, how many of you would be, so do that, thank you. And I have a recording of this and I will probably post that. Anything else?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank all of you.
Wonderful.
I have your email addresses, so I'll tell you when I do it again.
Great.